Under the soft glow of their favorite restaurant, she brought up the topic of privilege. Back then, he had no idea that night would mark the first fracture in their marriage. First came the conversations, then the interrogations. Charts, penalties, stopwatches, whiteboards filled with infographics of his guilt. Every word became evidence, every gesture, proof. Her pursuit of awareness morphed into control. Friends became witnesses to public interventions. The living room turned into a tribunal. He didn't resist. He observed. He learned. He took notes. The preparation took months. And then, an assembly, a whiteboard, a semicircle of judges. He entered, calm, with a briefcase full of evidence. "Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you stopped by my channel. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends or family. It really helps my channel a lot. Please tell me in which city or country you watch this video. I value every one of your comments. So, let's get started. The first time my wife mentioned the concept of male privilege, we were enjoying dinner at our favorite intimate restaurant. She had just returned from an intense 3-day workshop focused on social justice, buzzing with new terms and theories. I listened attentively, genuinely interested in the insights she was bringing home. At the time, I didn't realize that this seemingly casual conversation would mark the beginning of a gradual unraveling of our 5-year marriage. Over the following weeks, what started as sporadic discussions evolved into regular, almost ceremonial interrogations. Every evening, I'd come home to find her seated at the dining table, notebook open, ready to analyze my behavior from the day. At first, I approached these talks with a willingness to understand. Maybe there were things about myself I hadn't recognized. "You felt the need to show the cashier how to use the card reader," she'd note, pen poised. "And you were taking up too much space again on the subway." I'd try to explain. The cashier had actually asked for assistance, and the train car had been practically empty. But she dismissed my explanations as textbook avoidance, classic male defense mechanisms when confronted with privilege. Eventually, the conversations became more elaborate. A whiteboard appeared in the living room, cataloging my alleged infractions. It had columns labeled with infractions like interrupting, patronizing explanations, and unequal household labor. Despite contributing to chores, my side of the chart was always noticeably barren. The criteria kept shifting. Doing the dishes meant I was performing equality. Not mentioning them meant I was silently reinforcing control within the household. 3 months in, she introduced something new, a jar labeled privilege tax. Each time I was deemed to display a biased attitude, I had to contribute money, which she then donated to women's causes. I didn't oppose the principle, but in practice it felt more like punishment. When we spoke with my sister, you used the words "actually" and "the fact is." $5 for asserting intellectual dominance, she said one night, sliding the jar toward me. Then came the stopwatches. During social events, she began timing how long I spoke. Later, she'd show me charts and graphs illustrating how much I'd allegedly monopolized conversations. When I tried speaking less the next time, she accused me of weaponizing silence, forcing women to carry the conversational load. By the 6th month, I hardly recognized myself. Every gesture, every word, was under intense scrutiny. Was stretching my legs a show of territorial entitlement? Did the tone of my voice carry unintended power? I was constantly on edge, second-guessing everything I did. The breaking point came after a phone call with my father, who was gravely ill. I had just hung up, visibly shaken, when she pushed her notebook across the table. "You dominated the conversation. Your dad barely got a word in." I stared at her, stunned. My father had been too weak to talk and had asked me to share the details of my day to take his mind off the pain. Even that moment, sacred and deeply personal, had been dissected and judged. Something inside me shifted, an icy, sharp realization. This wasn't about self-improvement or awareness. It was emotional attrition. And quietly, for the first time, I understood. I didn't have to live like this. Things worsened when she began inviting others to join our sessions. What had once been private was now a spectacle. Twice a week, a few of her friends would gather in our living room, forming a circle as she recounted my weekly shortcomings. "He told me I was exaggerating about a financial issue last Thursday," she'd say evenly. "Gaslighting," they all agreed, nodding in unison. I wanted to respond, to explain that she had suggested spending $3,000 on a workshop called Dismantling the Patriarchy Through Interpretive Dance, at a time when we were saving for a home. But I'd learned the hard way that defending myself only cemented the accusations. One of her friends, a psychology grad student, became especially invested in analyzing me. "See how he folds his arms? Classic defensive body language, textbook fragile masculinity," she'd declare, scribbling notes. If I unfolded my arms, that too was suspect. No action escaped scrutiny. My wife had even begun keeping a leather-bound journal she titled The Privilege Chronicles. Each entry documented my statements, complete with color-coded highlights: blue for condescension, pink for subtle sexism, yellow for dominance in behavior. She made sure I noticed it, leaving it on the fridge next to the milk, on my pillow at night. Its presence was inescapable, a constant reminder that I was being observed, catalogued, judged. The most bizarre moment came during a dinner with her parents, when she accused me of breathing too loudly. Apparently, my normal breathing was a subconscious tactic to command auditory space and assert control during female-led conversation. I tried to reason with her. "I understand you want to confront systemic inequality," I said. "But this isn't dialogue anymore. It's cross-examination." She flashed a smile laced with condescension. The discomfort I felt in that moment? She framed it as a window into the daily reality of women. Her message was unmistakable. My unease was not just expected, it was evidence that her tactics were justified. Her reasoning operated like a closed loop, self-sustaining, impervious to contradiction. Any attempt I made to counter her points only served to bolster her argument further. If I agreed with her outright, I was an enabler. If I objected, I was proving her point about male privilege. Even silence became suspect, a passive form of aggression. But perhaps the most disturbing part was the way she began rewriting our shared history. Moments I had treasured, times when we uplifted and cared for one another, were now recast through the lens of her ideological framework. She once recalled our third date and said, "That hike you suggested? Classic example of asserting dominance in a masculine-coded setting." I remembered it clearly. She'd told me she loved the outdoors, so I picked a popular trail. What I thought had been a thoughtful gesture was now reinterpreted as patriarchal posturing. By the time 8 months had passed, I felt emotionally depleted. I barely spoke at home. I drifted from my friends. My job became the only space where I didn't feel scrutinized for hidden offenses I couldn't see, let alone control. The breaking point came when I discovered a file on our shared laptop titled Intervention Escalation Strategy. It was a blueprint for what lay ahead: engineered public confrontations, workplace pressure tactics, and what she termed privilege aversion therapy. Reading through it, an icy clarity took hold. This wasn't about education or awareness. It was a systematic plan to erode my identity. No matter how earnestly I tried to evolve, I would never succeed, because the rules were always shifting. It wasn't an invitation to grow. It was a trap designed to ensure my eventual collapse. In search of perspective, I began meeting a counselor during lunch breaks, never breathing a word of it to my wife. If she found out, she'd likely frame it as another example of me leveraging privilege to evade accountability. The counselor listened patiently as I described what life had become. During our third session, she stopped mid-note, looked me in the eye, and said, "This isn't growth or transformation," she said. "It's emotional abuse wrapped in the language of progress." Her words hit with jarring force. I'd been so consumed by guilt and self-suspicion that I couldn't see what was actually happening. The constant correction, the public shaming, the way our history was being rewritten, the slow detachment from my support network. These weren't tools for change. They were classic markers of abuse, dressed up in modern jargon. But she honestly believes she's helping the world, I said, uncertain. The counselor nodded. That could be true. Many controlling people are convinced they're acting for a higher good. But intent doesn't erase the harm they inflict. With that insight, everything began to look different. The so-called privilege jar wasn't about growth. It was a method of controlling money. The confrontations weren't educational. They were punitive. Her obsessive journaling wasn't awareness. It was surveillance. Still hoping to salvage what remained of us, I suggested couples counseling. I deliberately picked someone with a background in social justice issues, hoping to prevent an outright rejection. But her response was cutting. "So now you're trying to medicalize my activism?" She scoffed. "I'm not trying to pathologize anything," I replied, striving to stay calm. "I'm asking for a way to talk without this constant cycle of blame." She began pacing, visibly exasperated. "You still don't get it. This was never about your feelings. It's about justice. The fact that you're focused on your discomfort only proves why this work is essential. But how can we have a relationship when one of us holds all the power? Judge, jury, executioner?" I asked. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you seriously equating this to a court trial? That's exactly the kind of false comparison people use to dodge accountability." I inhaled slowly, steadying myself against the wave of dismissal I knew so well. "All I'm asking for is mutual respect, a chance to speak and be heard. I want a partnership, not an interrogation." For a split second, I thought I saw her waver, something softening behind her eyes. But just as fast, the wall went back up. "If you're not ready to face your privilege and commit to this process," she said, voice rising, "then maybe I need to reconsider whether I can stay married to someone who refuses to acknowledge the harm they're complicit in." There it was. The ultimatum I'd sensed was inevitable. Submit to her ongoing interventions or walk away. According to her worldview, there was no middle path. "I think we both need to reassess what we want from this relationship," I said, keeping my voice level, even as my heart pounded. That night, she moved into the guest room. I lay awake, and in that long silence, a stark truth settled over me. I'd spent nearly a year trying to earn a kind of redemption that was always just out of reach. No matter how I adapted, there was always a new accusation, another correction. Every word I spoke was filtered through a narrative that was built to convict me. And finally, in that stillness, I understood. Truly understood. This wasn't about mutual growth, fairness, or building a healthier partnership. It was a performance of control, draped in the language of equity. And for the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge a thought that had quietly lingered for years. Perhaps the most self-respecting action I could take was to walk away. The tipping point arrived during a dinner with 4 other couples. All evening, my wife had been subtly recording what she viewed as my social transgressions on her phone. I caught glimpses of her typing when I grabbed a drink for myself and not for others, labeled as selfishness. When I accidentally interrupted someone, tagged as conversational dominance. When I voiced a differing opinion on a movie, framed as invalidating female perspectives. Midway through the evening, she tapped her glass lightly. "I think this is a perfect moment for collective insight," she told the group. "I've been guiding my husband through a daily regimen designed to help him identify his privileges, and tonight has presented some useful examples." The room fell still. I felt the weight of 12 eyes settle on me as a slow burn crept up my neck. She looked at her phone and continued, "In just the last 60 minutes, he's exhibited 7 behaviors that reinforce patriarchal structures." She proceeded to recite each instance, complete with timestamps and brief commentary. One couple exchanged nervous looks. Another guest stared into her food. Only one woman seemed to support the display, nodding with approval. "As you can see," my wife concluded, These corrective practices are essential to dismantling ingrained patterns of power. She turned toward me, expecting the usual, a public apology, embarrassed and immediate. In the past, I would have complied, mumbled something vague just to diffuse the tension, but I was done playing that role. I calmly set down my napkin and said, "I appreciate your input. I'll take time to reflect on it." My even tone caught her off balance. The confession she had clearly anticipated never came. The silence that followed felt dense and uncomfortable. Although the dinner technically continued, the ease of earlier conversation never returned. On the way home, her anger simmered visibly. "That wasn't enough," she snapped. "You were supposed to acknowledge each point and lay out your next steps." "It was a social gathering," I replied quietly. "That wasn't the appropriate place for that kind of confrontation." "There's no wrong setting for confronting privilege," she shot back. "Your unease is exactly what needs examining." I nodded, not in consent, but as a recognition of something deeper. That was the moment everything clarified. She would never acknowledge a limit, never observe a boundary, as long as she believed she was serving a righteous cause. I had become an accessory to her ideology, no longer a person, but a project. The next morning, I called in sick and waited until she left for her weekly workshop on dismantling patriarchal norms. Once she was gone, I made 3 essential phone calls. The first was to my bank, where I ensured personal access to my accounts and began the process of separating our finances. I wasn't hiding assets. Everything would be split fairly, but I needed to prevent a financial ambush. The second call went to a divorce lawyer who specializes in defending men's rights. I outlined my situation with detached clarity, almost as though recounting someone else's experience. He listened carefully. "It's more common than you'd think," he said. "Let's focus on protecting your interests." The third call was to a real estate agent. I needed a contingency plan, options for housing in case things took a turn. Over the following 2 weeks, I acted with quiet precision. I documented everything: photos of whiteboards filled with scores, screenshots of her intervention templates, copies of the journals she had assigned me. I stored all essential documents and irreplaceable items in a secure lockbox, all while continuing to engage in her daily corrective routines just enough to remain under the radar. When she challenged me, I responded with neutral affirmations. "That's an interesting viewpoint," or "I can understand that perspective." I didn't resist, but I didn't comply either, just enough ambiguity to keep up the illusion. She interpreted it as progress. "He's finally getting it," I overheard her tell a friend over the phone. "The program is working." But I wasn't conforming. I was preparing. The man who had once exhausted himself trying to earn her approval, meeting unattainable expectations, no longer existed. In his place stood someone who could see clearly, who recognized manipulation disguised as moral instruction, and who knew that protecting one's dignity sometimes means choosing to leave. I spent another 2 weeks finalizing every detail. Then came the signal. A text. "Special intervention tonight. Entire accountability circle attending. Be home by 6. I walked through the door at 5:55 p.m., sharp, briefcase in hand. But it didn't contain work. It held everything I needed for my final appearance. Through the window, I saw 7 women seated in a semicircle. My wife stood in front of them, a fresh whiteboard behind her labeled in bold marker, "Comprehensive Privilege Assessment." I straightened my tie, inhaled deeply, and stepped inside with unwavering calm. The room froze the moment I entered. "You're right on time," my wife observed, checking her watch. "Tonight marks a significant checkpoint. After nearly 12 months of focused sessions, we're conducting a full evaluation of your progress." I acknowledged her with a respectful nod, placing my briefcase beside the chair that had been intentionally placed in the center of the room, the designated seat under scrutiny. "We'll begin by reviewing your recent behavior patterns," she continued, removing the cap from a red marker with purpose. "After that, the accountability circle will share their observations." Her tone was detached, methodical, like she was reading from a prepared script. "Lastly, will present the broader framework for your continued development over the next year. The way she casually referenced the coming year struck me hard. It clarified what had been gradually dawning on me. This wasn't a short-term effort or a temporary phase. It had become the structure of our marriage and her central purpose. "Before we get started," I said calmly, "there's something I'd like to present to the group, if that's permissible." She paused, caught off guard by my unscheduled interjection. "We're limited on time." "It won't take long," I assured her, releasing the latches of my briefcase. Instead of taking my place in the assigned chair, I remained standing just beside it, a minor but meaningful gesture of quiet defiance. Over the past year, I had been subjected to what she labeled privilege recalibrations. I'd complied, believing she was acting out of a desire for fairness and introspection. I removed a folder and drew out several pages of printed emails. But recently, I'd come across something unsettling. These messages, between my wife and members of this circle, unveiled a different story. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Those are confidential." "They contain step-by-step guidance," I said, holding up the documents, "on how to, and I quote, deconstruct resistant male participants through progressive psychological pressure. There's detailed planning around environmental manipulation and intentional isolation meant to ensure compliance." The energy in the room shifted instantly. A heavy stillness settled in. Two of the group members exchanged uncertain looks. One fixed her gaze on the floor. "This isn't education," I said firmly. "This isn't about empowerment. This is calculated control. In clinical terms, it aligns with emotional abuse." My wife's face flushed a deep, telling crimson. "You're twisting the facts." I lifted my hand, using the very signal she favored for cutting off discussion. "I'm not finished." The balance of authority had clearly shifted. I pulled out another sheet. "This is an expert assessment from a licensed therapist who specializes in emotional abuse dynamics. Based on anonymized but specific documentation of our interactions, the conclusion is definitive. This is textbook coercive behavior." I placed the report on the table. One woman leaned forward to read, then quickly leaned away, visibly shaken. "I've spent this last year questioning everything about myself, trying to evolve. I still believe in equity and in acknowledging privilege. But what's happened here wasn't about balance, it was about dominance." Her jaw tightened with indignation. That's exactly what someone dodging accountability would say. I had anticipated that, a familiar trap where any attempt to defend oneself only deepens the guilt. But I had stepped outside that mental loop. "I've taken time to reflect deeply on what a healthy relationship requires," I said. "Mutual respect, personal boundaries, the freedom to speak without fear of interrogation, and a foundational belief in each other's good intentions." From my briefcase, I removed one last document. This is a petition for divorce, on the grounds of sustained emotional mistreatment. It includes a compilation of the systematic tactics I've endured. My attorney will be contacting yours tomorrow. I placed the folder on the table. Silence followed like a wave. Members of the circle shifted uneasily. My wife stared at me, her face flickering between shock, anger, and a trace of dread. "You can't just walk away like this." "I'm claiming a right," I said, snapping the briefcase shut. "The right to dignity. To exit a relationship where I've been treated as a case study instead of a partner." I started toward the door, then turned briefly. "I've made other living arrangements for the time being. I'll coordinate with you to retrieve my belongings." I addressed the others in the room. "Ladies, this session is now concluded." As I walked to my car, I didn't feel victorious or defiant, only a quiet, resolute peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop fighting your own worth. Behind me, I heard voices stir, my wife's among them, already spinning a different version of events. But her narrative no longer bound me. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe. The fallout came quickly, as I had expected. Within hours, My phone buzzed with messages from her supporters, some accusatory, others attempting mediation. She launched what she called a restorative justice effort, which largely consisted of publicly discrediting me within our social network. She framed my departure as classic male fragility, as an unwillingness to face uncomfortable truths. I remained silent, communicating only through legal channels. Not to be vindictive, but for self-preservation. Any direct contact would have been distorted and used to reinforce her version of events. The divorce proceeded swiftly. The evidence I'd gathered proved essential, not for retaliation, but to ensure firm, enforceable boundaries. 6 months later, in a small apartment on the opposite side of the city, I sat in reflection, surveying the landscape of my transformed life. The ever-present judgment was gone. The oppressive weight had lifted. I no longer flinched when my phone lit up with a notification. The reflex to brace myself or draft a preemptive defense had faded away. I stopped navigating my home as if each step might trigger a hidden mine. The most unexpected part wasn't the sense of peace I felt. It was how many others reached out, quietly sharing that they had lived through similar patterns. One woman told me in a hushed voice, "What happened between you and your wife? We've seen it in our own circle too. The nitpicking, the public takedowns, the feeling like any casual conversation might turn into a confrontation. It's exhausting." A friend admitted, "I stayed silent, played the part. Speaking up meant getting labeled as part of the issue, but watching what you endured, it made me realize how toxic it had all become." Even someone from the so-called accountability group messaged me privately. "I joined because I believed in what we stood for," she said. But after that final meeting, with everything exposed, I saw it clearly. This wasn't about learning anymore. It had become something else entirely. Those private admissions helped confirm what I had been slowly learning. Real transformation doesn't come from control or dominance, no matter how righteous the words or how moral the cause. 3 months after the divorce, my ex-wife reached out. She suggested we meet for coffee, to talk, to reflect. I said no, kindly but firmly. Her response said it all. Refusing to engage is exactly the kind of entitled behavior that required intervention in the first place. That message cut through any illusions. She still saw me not as a human being with needs and boundaries, but as a problem to be corrected. The dynamic that had poisoned our relationship hadn't changed. It was alive and intact. Getting back into dating felt like walking through an unfamiliar country. I found myself hyper-aware of my words, bracing for judgment that never arrived. On a second date with a woman in environmental science, I caught myself apologizing after I mentioned some stats from her field. She looked at me, puzzled. "Why are you sorry?" "I didn't want to come off like I was telling you about your own work," I explained. She chuckled. "You were joining the conversation, not giving a lecture. That's how people talk." Her reaction struck a chord I hadn't realized was still tender. I began to understand. Real dialogue isn't combat. It's an honest rhythm, a shared space where both people contribute without suspicion or fear of being undermined. Now, a year out from that chapter of my life, I can say this with certainty. I believe in equality. I recognize privilege. I care deeply about justice. But I also understand now that genuine progress can't grow where mutual respect is absent. It flourishes through honest conversation, through compassion, through recognizing the full humanity in each other, not through manipulation, shame, or psychological control. The most profound truth I came to wasn't about politics or ideology. It was the realization that sometimes virtuous language can be used to excuse harmful behavior. And that real courage is choosing to walk away from anything that erodes your sense of self, no matter how noble it pretends to be. Some will say I turned my back on growth or accountability, but that's not my story. What I did was take ownership of my own emotional well-being. I chose not to participate in my own silencing. No mission, no matter how righteous, justifies treating someone else as less than. The privilege my wife assumed I would never claim turned out to be the most basic right of all, to be treated with dignity, to walk away from those who deny it, to build a life around mutual care instead of constant critique. That final night, as I pulled away from the house we had once shared, something invisible but weighty lifted from me, so heavy I hadn't realized how much it had bent me down. Each mile I drove gave me back a piece of something essential, something that had been taken bit by bit over time. It wasn't privilege, it was personhood, and I won't let anyone take that from me again. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you like this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.